There are rules in this house. Unspoken ones mostly. The kind you learn not from being told, but from watching how the air changes when he walks into a room. I learned them fast. Don't linger in the hallways past 9. Don't ask about the men who come and go through the side entrance. Don't make eye contact unless spoken to. And above all, never let yourself become visible. Not really. Not in the way that makes people remember your face. My name is Mia, and for 11 months, I had followed every single one of those rules without fail. I cleaned the East Wing on Mondays and Thursdays. I restocked the kitchen before 6 in the morning, before anyone else was awake. I kept my footsteps light on the marble floors, kept my cartwheels oiled so they wouldn't squeak, kept myself so small and so quiet that sometimes I wondered if I was slowly disappearing into the walls of this house. The Shin residence, that's what the staff called it, always formally, always with a certain stiffness, was the kind of place that demanded that from you. Not because anyone ever said so, but because the man who owned it was the kind of person whose silence alone could fill every room. Tae-hyung Shin. I had seen him maybe 30, 40 times in 11 months. Always from a distance. Always briefly. He moved through his own home like he was passing through. Present but untouchable. Deliberate in every step. Never wasting motion. He was younger than I'd expected when I first got the job. The agency had described the employer as a private businessman with high standards and a strict household schedule, which told me exactly nothing useful. What they hadn't mentioned was that he would be maybe 30, that he would wear black like it was a second skin, or that the tattoos climbing his neck would make every person in a room instinctively lower their voice without knowing why. I'd learned not to think about any of that. He was my employer. That was the entirety of our relationship, and it suited me fine. More than fine, actually. It suited me perfectly, because I needed this job. Not in the vague, general way people say they need things. I needed it the way you need air after being underwater too long. My mother's medical bills had been climbing since her diagnosis the previous winter, and the salary from the Shin residence was twice what I'd made at the hotel downtown. So I kept my head down. I did excellent work, and I let myself be invisible. That was the plan anyway. And it worked. For 11 months, it worked beautifully. The problem started on a Thursday. It started because of Daniel. Daniel Park was not someone I had expected to walk back into my life. We had dated briefly, 8 months, give or take, 2 years before I took the job at the Shin residence. It had ended without drama, without cruelty, just a quiet mutual recognition that we were headed in different directions. He'd moved to Atlanta. I'd stayed in Chicago. And then, last month, he moved back. He'd texted me out of nowhere, asked if I wanted to catch up over dinner, and I had said yes, because, honestly, because I was lonely. That's the truth I hadn't admitted to myself until I was already sitting across from him at Marisol, a small Italian place on West Randolph that I never would have been able to afford on my own budget. And he was smiling at me over a glass of sparkling water. And I was actually relaxed for the first time, in longer than I could measure. It was just dinner. That's all it was. 2 old friends in a restaurant, talking about their lives. I had requested the evening off through Mrs. Hahn, the head of household, the previous week. She'd approved it without question. I had no obligations to the Shin residence that Friday evening. None. I was a free woman sitting in a restaurant. And for 3 hours, I let myself forget about marble floors and unspoken rules, and the particular quality of silence that settled over an entire building when its owner was home. I should have known it wouldn't last. I noticed the shift in the restaurant before I understood what caused it. It was subtle at first. The kind of thing you feel before you see. The hum of conversation at the tables nearest the entrance dropped slightly, not to silence, but to something lower, more careful. A waiter who had been moving briskly slowed his pace. Even Daniel, mid-sentence about his new job in logistics, glanced briefly toward the door and lost the thread of what he was saying. I didn't turn around immediately. I reached for my water glass, took a slow sip, and told myself it was nothing. Then the temperature of the room changed. That's the only way I can describe it. Not literally. The air conditioning didn't shift. Nothing physical happened. But something in the atmosphere pulled taut, like a string being drawn too tight. And every instinct I had spent 11 months quietly developing in that house woke up at once. He's here. I turned. Taehyung Shin stood just inside the entrance of Marisol with 2 men I recognized as part of his regular security, both positioned slightly behind him and to either side. He was in a dark suit, no tie, the collar of his shirt open the way it always was, and the ink along his neck caught the warm restaurant lighting in a way that made several nearby diners pretend they weren't staring. The maitre d' was already moving toward him with the specific kind of hurry that wasn't quite running, and the reserved table near the back, the one that I now realized had been empty all evening despite the restaurant being busy, was suddenly, obviously, waiting for him. He hadn't seen me yet. Or if he had, nothing in his face showed it. I turned back to Daniel immediately, heart doing something strange and fast in my chest. "You okay?" Daniel asked, because apparently whatever I was feeling had made it onto my face. "Fine," I said. "Sorry. What were you saying?" He resumed his story. I nodded in the right places, and I spent the next 20 minutes very carefully not looking toward the back of the restaurant, which was exactly where Taehyung Shin had been seated, which was exactly in my direct line of sight, if I lifted my eyes even slightly. I lifted my eyes anyway. I couldn't help it. He was looking at me. Not the way people look at someone they've just noticed. Not the brief, accidental eye contact you make across a crowded room. He was looking at me the way he sometimes looked at documents on his desk, with full, steady, unreadable attention. Like he was taking inventory, like he was deciding something. Then his gaze moved to Daniel, and something in his expression, barely perceptible, barely there at all, shifted. I looked away. My hand resting on the table had gone completely still. "Mia," Daniel said. "You sure you're okay? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," I said again. But I wasn't quite. Because in 11 months of working in that house, of following every unspoken rule, of making myself invisible, I had never once felt the weight of Taehyung Shin's full attention directed at me. Not like that. Not with that particular stillness that I was only now recognizing, from the outside, as something other than indifference. I didn't know what it was yet. I would find out soon enough. Dinner ended. Daniel walked me to my car. We said goodnight like the old friends we were, and I drove home telling myself that whatever I had imagined I'd seen across that restaurant was nothing. A trick of the light. A coincidence of timing. By the time I pulled into my parking spot, I almost believed it. The next morning, I arrived at the Shin residence at my usual time, 5:45, through the service entrance, badge scanned, cartwheels silent. Everything was exactly as it always was. Mrs. Han gave me the morning assignment sheet without looking up from her desk. 2 of the security staff were changing shifts in the side hallway. The kitchen smelled like coffee, and something quieter underneath, the particular scent of a house that had been still all night. I started in the east wing. Routine. Predictable. Safe. I was changing the linen in the 3rd guest room when I heard footsteps in the corridor outside. Not the soft, shuffling sounds of the other staff, but the slow, deliberate kind that I recognize the way you recognize a sound you've been unconsciously cataloging for almost a year. They stopped outside the door. I kept my hands moving, kept smoothing the sheet corner, kept my breathing even. The door opened. Taehyung Shin stood in the doorway of the guest room, a room he had absolutely no reason to be in on a Friday morning, and looked at me with the same steady, measuring expression he'd worn across the restaurant the night before. He said nothing for a moment, just stood there, one hand resting loosely on the doorframe, his dark eyes moving from my face to the cart behind me and back. "You were out last night," he said finally. His voice was low and even. It wasn't a question. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a statement, delivered with the particular flatness that I had come to understand meant he already knew the answer and was watching to see what I would do with it. I set the pillow in my hands down on the bed. I had the evening approved through Mrs. Hahn, I said carefully. If there was a scheduling issue, I apologize. I wasn't aware of any. There wasn't a scheduling issue. Silence. He looked at me for one more moment. That same inventory expression, that same quality of attention that felt like standing in a doorway between two very different rooms. Then he stepped back, turned, and walked away down the corridor. I stood in the guest room for a full 30 seconds without moving. What just happened? I didn't have an answer. And somehow, standing there in the quiet with the unmade bed behind me and the sound of his footsteps fading down the hall, I understood for the first time in 11 months that I had made a mistake. Not a scheduling mistake, not a professional one. I had let him see me, and now I had absolutely no idea what that meant. The weekend passed without incident. That was the word I kept using in my own head. Incident. As though Friday morning had been some kind of minor workplace irregularity that could be filed away and forgotten. Tae-hyung hadn't appeared again. Mrs. Hahn had given me my Saturday assignments with the same brisk efficiency as always. The house had settled back into its usual rhythms, and by Sunday evening I had nearly convinced myself that the conversation in the guest room had meant nothing at all. Nearly. The problem was that I couldn't stop turning it over. You were out last night. 3 words, stated like a fact, with no follow-up, no explanation, no indication of why he had walked into a room he had no business being in just to say them. I'd replayed the moment enough times that the edges of it were starting to blur, and I knew that was dangerous. That kind of thinking, that kind of attention paid to a man like Tae-hyung Shin was exactly what the unspoken rules of this house were designed to prevent. Not for his protection, for mine. I showed up Monday morning and did my job. The east wing, the kitchen inventory, the second-floor hallway windows, which needed wiping down because the weekend rain had left streaks across the glass. I moved through my tasks with the focused efficiency that had kept me employed here for nearly a year, and I did not think about Friday. I didn't think about the restaurant, or the way the room had shifted when he walked in, or the expression on his face when his gaze had moved from me to Daniel. I especially did not think about that last part. It was around 11 when I noticed something different. I was in the main corridor on the second floor, finishing the windows, when I became aware that one of the security staff, a broad-shouldered man named Mr. Kwan, who usually stationed himself near the front entrance, was standing at the far end of the hallway. Not doing anything. Just standing there, in a position that gave him a direct sightline to where I was working. I'd seen Mr. Kwan dozens of times. He'd never paid me any particular attention. Security staff and household staff existed in parallel tracks in a place like this. We moved through the same spaces but rarely intersected. I told myself he was just taking a different post today. But then, 2 hours later, when I moved my cart to the 3rd floor to start on the linen closets, I noticed a different member of the security team, younger. Someone I knew only as the one who always held the side door on Tuesday mornings, positioned at the top of the staircase. Again, doing nothing overtly. Again, with a clear view of my location. I stopped in front of the linen closet and stared at the shelves for a long moment without actually seeing them. Am I being watched? The thought should have alarmed me. Honestly, it did alarm me. But underneath the alarm was something more complicated. A kind of bewildered confusion, because I could think of absolutely nothing I had done that would warrant this level of attention. I was a maid. I cleaned rooms. I had never taken anything. Never been in a space I wasn't assigned to. Never deviated from my schedule in any way that wasn't pre-approved. Except for Friday evening, which had been pre-approved. I finished my shift without saying anything to anyone about what I'd noticed, went home, and sat at my kitchen table for a long time, thinking about absolutely nothing productive. Tuesday was the same. The quiet, steady presence of security staff in my peripheral vision, never close enough to be confrontational, never obvious enough to be a clear statement. But there. Always there, wherever I moved in the house. By Tuesday afternoon, I had started to feel like a slow-moving object being quietly tracked across a map. Wednesday, I decided to ask Mrs. Hahn directly. She was in her office off the kitchen, reviewing the weekly supply orders, when I knocked and entered. She looked up with the particular expression she always wore. Efficient, not unkind, but fundamentally businesslike. "Mia, what do you need?" "I wanted to ask," I said, keeping my voice steady, "whether there's been any change to the household security protocols. I've noticed increased staff presence on the floors where I'm working, and I want to make sure I'm not accidentally interfering with anything." Mrs. Hahn regarded me for a moment. Something passed through her expression. Not quite surprise, but something adjacent to it. "There's been no change to your assignment," she said. "Your work has been fine. Is there anything specific that's made you uncomfortable?" "No," I said. "I just wanted to be sure I understood the current expectations." She nodded once, slowly, and turned back to her supply sheets in a way that clearly ended the conversation. But as I was turning to leave, she said, without looking up, "Mia." I stopped. "Do your job well. That's all that's required of you." It wasn't an answer, but the way she said it, carefully, like someone placing a fragile object on a shelf, told me that she knew more than she was willing to explain, and that the kindest thing she could do was point me back toward the safety of routine. I thanked her and left. Thursday came, and with it something I hadn't anticipated. Daniel texted in the afternoon, while I was on my break in the small staff room near the service entrance. "Had a great time Friday. Want to do it again this weekend. There's a new place that opened on Michigan Ave." I read the message twice. It was a perfectly reasonable text from a perfectly reasonable person. There was nothing complicated about it. I typed back, "Sounds good. Saturday works for me." I did not examine why my hands felt slightly unsteady while I typed it. I put my phone away, finished my break, and went back to work. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was that 20 minutes later, when I was back on the second floor finishing my afternoon tasks, Taehyung Shin was in his study at the far end of the east wing, and one of his security staff had just told him something. I didn't know what was said. I didn't know how it was said, or what expression Taehyung wore when he heard it. I found out the shape of that conversation indirectly, the way you find out most things in a house like that, through consequences rather than causes. Because on Friday morning, when I arrived at my usual time and scanned my badge at the service entrance, the reader flashed green as always. But Mrs. Hahn was already waiting in the kitchen, which she never was at 5:45, and she had a piece of paper in her hand. "Your assignments have been adjusted," she said, handing it to me. I looked at the sheet. My regular East Wing schedule was gone. In its place was a new rotation, one that included the main floor reception rooms, the formal dining room, the private library on the ground floor, and the hallway outside the main study. "Is there a reason for the change?" I asked, keeping my voice entirely neutral. "Routine rotation," Mrs. Hahn said. "All staff assignments rotate periodically. 11 months. My assignments had not rotated once in 11 months. I took the sheet. "Of course," I said. I started with the reception rooms, which were large and formal and rarely used, all dark wood and carefully arranged furniture that never seemed to shift position no matter how many weeks passed. Then the dining room, which smelled faintly of the candles that were lit on the rare occasions when Taehyung had guests. Then the library, floor-to-ceiling shelves, and the kind of quiet that felt intentional, architectural. And then the hallway outside the main study. I was halfway through dusting the console table that ran along the corridor wall when the study door opened and Taehyung stepped out. No warning, no sound of movement inside before the door swung open, Or maybe there had been, and I hadn't been paying close enough attention. He was in dark trousers and a white shirt, sleeves pushed to his elbows, and he stopped when he saw me with the same absence of visible surprise that I was starting to understand was simply how he moved through the world. Nothing caught him off guard. Or if it did, no one ever saw it. He looked at me for a moment, then at the hallway around me, then back at my face. "You changed assignments," he said. "Mrs. Hahn updated my rotation," I said carefully. Something at the corner of his mouth shifted. Not quite an expression, not quite nothing. "The library," he said. "The shelves near the south window collect dust faster than the rest. The air circulation is uneven." I blinked. "I'll make sure to pay extra attention to that area." He nodded once, very slightly, started to turn back toward his study. "Mr. Shin," I said. He stopped, turned back, just enough to look at me over his shoulder. I had not planned to say anything. But something about the weight of the past week, the security staff, the reassigned schedule, the way this entire house seemed to have quietly reorganized itself around my movements without anyone offering me a single direct explanation, made the words arrive before I'd properly decided to speak them. "Is there something I've done wrong?" I asked. "I'd prefer to know directly if there's a concern with my work." The silence that followed lasted long enough that I wondered if I had made a serious error in judgment. His eyes stayed on me, steady and unreadable, with that quality of attention that made the air feel heavier. "Your work is not the concern," he said finally. Then he went back into his study and closed the door. I stood in the hallway with my cleaning cloth in my hand, and the absolute certainty that something had changed in this house. Not in the walls, not in the schedule, not in any of the visible, practical structures of the place, but in something underneath all of that. Something I didn't yet have the language to name. I texted Daniel that evening to confirm Saturday. He sent back a cheerful confirmation and the name of the restaurant. I set my phone on my nightstand, looked at the ceiling of my small apartment, and thought about a pair of dark, still eyes watching me from across a restaurant. Watching me, and then shifting, just barely, to look at the man sitting across the table from me. "Your work is not the concern." I fell asleep with those words still turning in my head, quiet and persistent as water finding its way through stone. Saturday arrived the way weekends do when you've been dreading and anticipating something in equal measure. Too fast and somehow also too slow. The hours between Friday night and 7 in the evening feeling both compressed and endless. I changed my outfit 3 times, which was not something I typically did, and I spent 10 minutes standing in front of my bathroom mirror having a quiet argument with myself about why I was nervous. It was just dinner. Daniel was easy company. There was absolutely nothing complicated about any of this. I believed that right up until I walked into Galleria, the new place on Michigan Avenue, and felt my phone buzz in my bag. I assumed it was Daniel. I pulled it out at the hostess stand while I waited. It wasn't Daniel. It was a message from an unsaved number, just a series of digits I didn't recognize. And the message itself was 3 words. "Be careful tonight." I stared at it, read it again, looked up at the hostess, who was smiling at me with professional patience, and managed to tell her I was meeting someone. Last name Park. She led me to a table near the window, and I sat down and looked at the message a 3rd time, as though reading it more carefully would make it make more sense. It didn't. I almost texted back, "Who is this?" But something stopped me. Some instinct I'd developed over 11 months in a house full of unspoken rules and deliberate silences. Instead, I set the phone face down on the table just as Daniel appeared, shaking rain off his jacket and apologizing for being 3 minutes late, and I smiled and said it was fine and told myself to let it go. But I couldn't quite let it go. Not entirely. It sat under the surface of the evening like a stone in shallow water. Invisible if you weren't looking. Impossible to ignore once you'd noticed it. Daniel talked about his new apartment, his sister's upcoming wedding. a documentary he'd watched about deep-sea exploration. I asked questions and laughed in the right places and ate my pasta. And the whole time, a small, alert part of my brain was cataloging the room around us. About 40 minutes into dinner, I noticed the man at the bar. He was Korean, maybe mid-30s, unremarkable in appearance, dark jacket, glass of water in front of him, not drinking. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at his phone. But he had been sitting in exactly the same position since before I arrived, and in the time we'd been at our table, no one had joined him, and he hadn't ordered food. I recognized him. Not his name. I didn't know his name, but his face. He was one of Taehyung's security staff. Not Mr. Kwon, not the one from the staircase on Monday. A different one. But I had seen him twice in the residence, briefly, passing through the service corridor. My fork stilled against my plate. "Hey," Daniel said. "You've gone somewhere else again." "Sorry." I set the fork down. "I think I might know someone here. It just caught me off guard." "You want to go say hi?" "No," I said. "It's fine." It was not fine. Because if that man was here, in this specific restaurant on this specific evening, then he was here because someone had sent him. And the only person who could have sent a member of his security team to a restaurant I had chosen on a Tuesday via a text message to Daniel was Taehyung Shin. Which meant Taehyung knew where I was tonight. Which meant be careful tonight had come from a number connected to him or his organization. Which meant, and this was the part my brain kept snagging on, unable to get past, that he was having me watched. Not inside his own house, where it could be explained away as general security protocol, but here, outside the residence, on my personal time. I got through the rest of dinner on autopilot. I laughed, I talked, I split a dessert with Daniel because he insisted, and the entire time I was performing a version of myself that was calm and present, while the actual version of me was sitting very still inside my own chest, thinking carefully. Daniel walked me to my car again. Same as last time. He was a good person. Warm, straightforward, uncomplicated. He mentioned getting together again next week, and I said something non-committal that was technically not a no, and then I was alone in my car watching him disappear around the corner, and I sat there for a full minute without starting the engine. Then I drove. Not home, not directly. I needed the motion, the dark streets sliding past, the space to think without walls around me. I looped north along the lake, the water black and flat on my right, and I thought about 11 months of unspoken rules, and a man who had never once paid me any visible attention until he saw me across a restaurant on a Thursday evening. "You were out last night. Your work is not the concern. Be careful tonight." I went home eventually. I double-checked that my door was locked. I slept badly. Monday morning, I walked into the Shin residence at 5:45, and everything was exactly as it always was, except that it wasn't. The difference was subtle. A degree of alertness in the security staff that felt slightly elevated, a particular quality of silence on the upper floors that I'd learned to read as meaning Taehyung was somewhere in the building and awake and thinking. Mrs. Han handed me my assignment sheet. Same new rotation as last week. Library, reception rooms, main floor corridor, hallway outside the study. I did the library first. South window shelves. Extra attention, as instructed. I was in the reception room when I heard voices down the corridor, low, rapid in Korean, which I didn't speak but had grown accustomed to hearing. One voice was unfamiliar, the other wasn't. They stopped somewhere nearby, and then there was a long silence, and then just one set of footsteps continuing down the hall. Taehyung appeared in the doorway of the reception room. He looked at me for a moment, then at the room around me, with the particular expression I had started privately cataloging as his assessing look. Not cold, not warm, just intensely, quietly focused. "Saturday evening," he said. "Was it a good dinner?" My hands kept moving. I was polishing the surface of the side table near the window. and I kept the cloth moving in steady circles because stopping would tell him something. It was pleasant. Thank you, I said. Michigan Avenue, he said. Not a question. Just the words, dropped into the space between us like stones into still water. I set the cloth down and turned to face him directly. It was perhaps not the wisest choice, but something had shifted in me since Saturday. Something that had been quietly hardening in the days between Be Careful Tonight and this moment. Mr. Shin, I said, can I ask you something directly? He waited. That was his response. Just stillness and waiting. Was there a member of your staff at Galleria on Saturday evening? The silence stretched for 4 full seconds. I counted. Yes, he said. Just that. No explanation, no qualifier, no apology. I had expected the admission to make me angrier than it did. Instead, I felt something strange. Not relief, exactly, but the particular sensation of solid ground after an extended period of being uncertain about where you were standing. Why? I asked. He looked at me with that steady, unreadable attention. His right hand, resting at his side, moved slightly, just the fingers, a small, almost imperceptible adjustment, the way a person moves when they're choosing words carefully. The man you were with, he said. Daniel Park. He's a friend, I said. A former... I stopped. A friend. I know who he is. The way he said it, quiet, factual, with that slight weight underneath, made me understand that knowing who he is meant something considerably more thorough than having seen him across a restaurant once. You had him looked into, I said. I had the situation assessed, he said, which was not a denial. I took a slow breath. I appreciate that this is your home and you have security concerns. But my private life... There are people, he said, cutting across me without raising his voice, without any heat at all, who are aware of where you work, who you work for. That creates a specific kind of risk that has nothing to do with your conduct and everything to do with your proximity to this household. I stared at him. He said it so plainly, so matter-of-factly, as though explaining a weather pattern or a logistical arrangement. That creates a specific kind of risk. Like my personal safety was a variable in an equation he had been quietly calculating without telling me it existed. You think someone might try to use me? I said slowly. To get to you. He didn't answer. He didn't need to. The answer was already sitting in the room, had been sitting there since the moment he walked in. And Daniel, he's clean, Taehyung said. Simple, direct. He's not connected to anyone relevant. He's exactly what he appears to be. Something in my chest loosened slightly at that. An involuntary, undignified flood of relief that I immediately tried to keep off my face. So the person who texted me Saturday, I said, that was a precaution, in case the assessment had been wrong. I looked at him. He looked back at me. The morning light came through the reception room windows at a low, sharp angle and caught the ink along his neck. And the room was very quiet, and I was aware all at once of how strange this conversation was, how far outside every boundary and unspoken rule it had traveled, calmly, and without any apparent alarm on his part. You could have told me, I said, about the risk, about why the security arrangement changed. Yes, he said. But you didn't. No. Another silence, longer this time. I'm telling you now, he said finally, and something in the way he said it, not quite an apology, not quite an explanation, occupying some third space I didn't have a name for, made the words land differently than I expected. He left the reception room without another word. I stood in the morning light for a long time after, the polishing cloth still in my hand, thinking about the specific texture of a silence that wasn't empty. that was, in fact, very full, of things acknowledged and things still unspoken, of a conversation that had somehow changed the dimensions of the space between two people, without either of them quite meaning it to. I finished my shift. I went home. I sat at my kitchen table and looked at the unsaved number still sitting in my message thread, and I thought about what it meant that the most direct, honest conversation I'd had with anyone in months had just happened, with a man whose world operated entirely in shadows. And I thought about the way he'd said, "I'm telling you now," like it cost him something, like it was, in its own strange, controlled way, significant. I didn't text Daniel back that week. The week that followed was different. Not dramatically. Nothing in that house ever changed dramatically. Everything shifted by degrees, in the slow, deliberate way that Tae-hyung Shin seemed to approach every aspect of his existence. But different in ways I noticed because I had spent 11 months learning to read the particular language of that residence, and now something in the grammar of it had changed. The security staff still moved through the floors where I worked, but the quality of their presence had changed. It felt less like surveillance now, and more like something I didn't have a precise word for. Accompaniment, maybe. The distinction was subtle but real, and I felt it the way you feel a shift in air pressure before weather changes, not threatening, just present. Mrs. Han stopped giving me assignment sheets. That was perhaps the strangest thing. On Wednesday morning, she simply told me that my rotation would remain as established, and that I could use my own judgment on sequencing within it. 11 months of detailed, itemized sheets, and now, use your own judgment. I thanked her, and didn't ask why. Thursday, something happened that I hadn't anticipated. I was in the library, south window shelves, which genuinely did collect dust faster than the rest, which meant that Tae-hyung had been paying enough attention to his own house to know that, which I kept catching myself thinking about at odd moments, when I heard the study door open down the corridor. Not unusual. But then footsteps approaching the library, which was less usual. And then Tae-hyung himself stood in the doorway holding 2 cups of coffee. I looked at the cups. I looked at him. Neither of us said anything for a moment. He crossed the room and set 1 cup on the reading table near where I was working. Black. No additions. Then he moved to the desk in the corner. The library had a secondary desk, smaller than the one in his study, which I had always assumed was purely decorative since I had never seen anyone use it, and sat down and opened a folder he'd brought with him. He began working. I stood there for approximately 4 seconds, recalibrating everything I thought I understood about the structure of this job, and then I turned back to the shelves and kept working. We existed in the same room for 40 minutes. He read documents and made occasional notes. I cleaned shelves and reorganized a section of books that had drifted out of order. The coffee on the table steamed and then slowly cooled, and at some point I picked it up and drank some of it, because leaving it untouched felt stranger than accepting it. He didn't look up when I did. Or if he did, it wasn't while I was watching. The silence between us was not uncomfortable. That was the thing I kept noticing, kept coming back to. It should have been uncomfortable. The power imbalance alone should have made it tense, should have made every small sound feel amplified and wrong. But it wasn't. It was just quiet. The particular kind of quiet that 2 people create when they've tacitly agreed to share a space without demanding anything from each other. I finished the shelves. I gathered my supplies. "The Whitmore account," he said, without looking up from his folder. I stopped. "I'm sorry?" "The man you saw me speaking with on Monday," he said, "in the corridor. His name is Whitmore. He manages legitimate business interests, real estate primarily, that interface with my organization. He'll be in the house periodically over the next several weeks." He looked up then, briefly, the way he looked up from documents when something required direct attention. "I'm telling you in advance this time." Something loosened in my chest, again. The same involuntary response as last week. as though my body had decided to respond to his honesty with a physical reaction before my brain had processed it. "Thank you," I said. He looked back at his folder. "The East Wing guest rooms, the third one. The window latch has been stiff. Maintenance has been notified, but they've been slow. I'll add it to my notes," I said. "It's the second latch from the left." "Second from the left," I repeated. He nodded, the smallest possible nod, and turned a page. I left the library and stood in the corridor outside with my cart and my supplies, and a strange, warm, bewildered feeling in my sternum that I was fairly determined not to examine too closely. The following week, Whitmore came as promised, a heavy-set man in his 60s with sharp eyes and an expensive watch, who moved through the residence with the particular confidence of someone who'd been there before. He was always accompanied by two of his own people, and whenever he and Taehyung were together in the main floor rooms, the entire household staff operated on a sort of quiet, collective understanding that those spaces were off-limits until the meeting concluded. I stayed in my rotation: library, reception rooms, corridor. On the third day of Whitmore's visits, I was in the reception room when I heard raised voices. Not shouting, exactly, but something close. One voice was Whitmore's, carrying down the hall with the confidence of a man accustomed to filling rooms. The other was Taehyung's, and the contrast was immediate and sharp, measured where Whitmore was expansive, quiet where Whitmore was loud. I couldn't make out the words, and I didn't try to. I kept working. 10 minutes later, a door opened and closed. Then Taehyung's footsteps in the corridor. He stopped in the reception room doorway, a position that was becoming, I realized, a kind of pattern between us. "The Whitmore arrangement is concluding," he said. "He won't return after today." I looked at him. His expression was entirely composed, but something around the set of his jaw told me the meeting had not gone the way he'd intended. "Is everything all right?" I asked. It was not a question a maid asked her employer. It was outside the lines of every professional boundary that governed this arrangement. I knew that when the words left my mouth. He looked at me for a moment with that considering stillness. "It will be," he said. And somehow that was both more and less reassuring than a simple yes. Whitmore left that afternoon. The house resettled. By evening, it had returned to its usual quality of quiet, and I finished my shift and was collecting my things from the staff room when Mrs. Han appeared in the doorway. "Mr. Shin has asked whether you'd be willing to adjust your schedule temporarily," she said. "Starting next week. Arriving 30 minutes earlier, leaving 30 minutes later. There would be additional compensation for the extended hours." I looked at her. "Did he say why?" "Adjustment period," she said, which meant nothing, and probably meant everything. "You're not obligated." "I'll do it," I said. She nodded and left. I stood in the staff room for a moment, jacket half on, thinking about what adjustment period might mean in the particular vocabulary of this household. And then something occurred to me. A small, obvious thing that I somehow hadn't fully registered until this moment. Taehyung Shin had never once, in 11 months, asked anything of me directly through Mrs. Han. Every adjustment, every change, every new requirement had come through the official channels of the household management structure. He had never made a personal request. Not until this week. Not until after 2 dinners with Daniel, and a conversation about risk, and 40 minutes of shared library silence and a cup of black coffee cooling on a reading table. I drove home thinking about that. About how much a person can communicate without saying the thing directly. About how 11 months of careful invisibility could be undone not by something dramatic, not by a confrontation or a revelation or a moment of crisis, but by something as ordinary as being seen across a restaurant on a Thursday evening, by the small, accumulated weight of being noticed. My phone buzzed. Daniel, asking about this weekend. I sat with the message for a long time. Daniel was a good person. Warm, uncomplicated, easy. He represented something simple and manageable in a life that had become, without my quite noticing it, considerably less simple and considerably less manageable. I typed back. I need to take a rain check. Things have gotten a bit complicated at work. He replied with a cheerful, "No worries. Let me know when things settle down," which was such a perfectly Daniel response that it made something in my chest ache slightly. Not for him, exactly, but for the version of my life in which things were uncomplicated enough that a pleasant dinner with a pleasant person was the most significant thing happening in my week. That version felt very far away. Friday was quiet. I worked my extended hours, arrived at 5:15, left at 5:30 in the evening, and in the extra time I covered the main staircase railings and the entrance foyer, which rarely got the attention they deserved. I was finishing the foyer when I heard the front door open, unusual because Taehyung always used the east entrance, and he walked in with 2 of his security team and stopped when he saw me. I was on my knees on the marble floor, addressing a stubborn mark near the base of the front door frame. Not exactly a dignified position. I sat back on my heels and looked up at him. He looked at me, looking up at him. Something in his expression moved, quick and subtle, and gone before I could properly identify it. "You're still here," he said. "Extended hours," I said. "Mrs. Han." "I know," he said. "I requested it." "I know," I said. "She told me." Another silence. The 2 security team members behind him were doing that thing they were very professionally trained to do, which was to be present without appearing to pay attention to anything in particular. "The front entrance gets overlooked," I said, because the silence had gone on long enough, and I needed to say something that was about work rather than about whatever was actually happening in this foyer. The marble near the frame traps grime in the grout lines. He looked at the floor, then back at my face. "You notice things," he said. It sounded like an observation he'd been carrying for a while. "So do you," I said. The words arrived before I'd approved them. I watched something shift in his expression. Not surprise, exactly, but the particular quality of stillness that meant he was paying very close attention. He said nothing. He walked past me toward the east corridor, his security team following. At the edge of the foyer, he paused, just briefly, without turning around. "The compensation increase will be reflected in this month's payment," he said. Then he was gone. I knelt on the marble floor of the empty foyer for a long moment, looking at the front door, listening to the quiet of the house settle around me like something living. "You notice things. So do you." 2 sentences. 48 hours later, I still couldn't stop thinking about them, about what it meant that we had said them at all, about what they had acknowledged between us, about how 2 people who existed in such fundamentally different worlds had somehow, without planning or intending it, started to see each other clearly. And about how clearly that changed everything. It was Mrs. Han who finally said it plainly. She was not a woman who wasted words. And in 11, nearly 12, months of working alongside her, I had never once heard her speak about anything that wasn't directly related to the operational management of the household. So when she appeared in the library on a Tuesday morning, closed the door behind her, and stood with her hands folded in front of her in a way that was slightly different from her usual posture, slightly less official, slightly more human, I set down the book I was reshelving and gave her my full attention. "You're a good worker, Mia," she said. "You've always been a good worker." "Thank you," I said carefully. "This is not a standard household," she continued, which was perhaps the largest understatement I had ever heard delivered with a straight face. "The people who work here long-term understand that. They adapt. They learn the particular requirements of this environment, and they operate within them, and they build something stable." She paused. "What is less stable, what has historically created difficulty, is when the boundaries of those requirements become unclear." I waited. "Mr. Shin," she said, does not make personal requests. He does not adjust staff compensation outside the annual review cycle. He does not bring coffee into rooms where staff are working. She looked at me steadily. In 14 years, I have not seen him do any of those things. The library was very quiet. Outside the south window, the city moved at its usual pace, indifferent and distant. "Mrs. Hahn," I said, "I haven't done anything to—" "I know," she said. "That's not what I'm suggesting." She unfolded her hands, a small gesture of release. "I'm suggesting that you think carefully about your own position, about what you want, about whether what is currently developing in this household is something you're prepared to navigate, because it won't simplify. It will not become easier or more straightforward over time. Things in this house never do." She moved toward the door, then stopped. "He asked me yesterday," she said, her back still to me, "whether your mother's medical situation had improved." A pause. "I told him I didn't know. He said to find out." She left. I stood between the shelves for a long time. The south window light moved slowly across the floor. I could hear, distantly, the sounds of the house around me. Footsteps, a door, the low hum of the building's ventilation. And underneath all of it, that particular quality of presence that told me Taehyung was somewhere in the building, awake and thinking. He had asked about my mother, not my job performance, not my schedule, my mother. I thought about 11 months of being invisible, and then I thought about the strange, quiet weeks that had followed one Thursday evening at a restaurant on West Randolph, the coffee on the library table, the honest conversation about risk, the 40 minutes of shared silence that hadn't been uncomfortable at all. I thought about you notice things and so do you, spoken in a foyer at the end of the day, two people acknowledging each other across a distance that had been quietly shrinking without either of them deciding to close it. I thought about what Mrs. Hahn had said. It will not become easier. And I thought, I know. But easier had never really been what I was looking for. Easier was the hotel job downtown at half the salary. Easier was keeping my head down and my footsteps light, and letting myself disappear into the walls. I had done easy for 11 months, and it had been fine, sufficient, survivable. But it had not been this, whatever this was. I finished the library. I moved through my rotation. And at 3 p.m, when I was in the corridor outside the study and the door opened and Taehyung stepped out, I didn't wait for him to speak first. "You asked about my mother," I said. He stilled, looked at me. "Mrs. Hahn told me," I said. "You asked her to find out how she was doing." Something moved behind his eyes. A brief, involuntary thing that was gone almost before it existed. He said nothing. "She's doing better," I said. "The treatment she started in January. They adjusted the dosage in March, and it's been more effective. She had a good checkup last week." I paused. "I haven't told anyone here about that because it didn't seem relevant to my work." "It isn't relevant to your work," he said. A beat. It was relevant to me. The corridor was quiet. One of his security staff was visible at the far end, a distant, deliberately inattentive presence. "Why?" I asked. He considered the question the way he considered everything, with that complete, unhurried attention that made a person feel like the only thing in the room. "Because you've been carrying it alone," he said. "Since before you started here. The agency file noted a family medical situation as the reason you needed the position urgently." He paused. "I read the files for all household staff. It's standard. But I remembered yours. You remembered mine," I repeated slowly. "Yes." "Yes," he said again, cutting gently across the obvious end of that sentence. I looked at him. He looked back. The space between us was not large. We were perhaps 6 feet apart in a corridor that was wide enough to accommodate the distance comfortably, but something about the conversation had made it feel smaller. not uncomfortable. Just closer to honest than either of us had been with anyone in a while, I suspected. "I don't know what to do with this," I said quietly. Not a complaint. Just the truth, stated plainly, because he had spoken plainly to me, and it seemed only right to return it. "Neither do I," he said. I blinked. Whatever I'd expected, it wasn't that. Not that clean an admission. Not that quickly given. "The honest answer," he continued, "is that you are an employee of this household, and I am aware of exactly what that means and what it should preclude. I'm also aware that I have been operating outside those boundaries for the past several weeks, and that I owe you a direct acknowledgement of that fact." He paused. "And an explanation, rather than asking Mrs. Hahn to quietly reorganize the structure of your workday without your understanding why." "A direct acknowledgement," I said. "Yes." "And the explanation?" He was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of evasion. The silence of choosing the right words for something that didn't have ready-made language. "When I saw you across that restaurant," he said, "with someone I didn't know, I understood that I had been so focused on making you invisible inside this household that I had failed to consider that you existed outside it, that you had a life, people, a world that had nothing to do with these walls." Something shifted in his expression. Not quite discomfort, but its composed, contained cousin. That bothered me considerably more than it should have. The corridor was very still. "Because of the security risk," I said carefully. "Initially," he said. "I was honest about that part. But that wasn't all of it, and I think you already know that." I did know that. I had known it since the library, maybe since the foyer, maybe since the first morning he'd stepped into the guest room on a Friday and told me there was no scheduling issue. "I think," I said slowly, "that I've known for a while that something was different. I kept telling myself it was just the unusual nature of this household, that I was reading too much into things." "You weren't," he said. "No," I agreed. "I wasn't." We stood in the corridor looking at each other, and the strange thing was that it was not awkward. It was, somehow, the most settled I had felt in months, as though every careful, circling conversation that had come before this one had been moving toward this point of plain honesty, the way water moves toward level ground. "I'm not going to pretend," he said, "that my world is simple, or that working here doesn't come with complications I have no right to impose on you without your full understanding of what they are. The risk I mentioned, it's real. It's ongoing. The people around me require a level of caution that affects everyone in proximity, and that's not something I can change." "I know," I said. "I've known since you explained it." "And?" I looked at him steadily. "And I'm still here." Something happened in his expression then, quiet and significant, like a door opening in a room that had been closed for a very long time. It wasn't dramatic. It was just real, and I thought that was perhaps more valuable than dramatic. What followed wasn't immediate or simple. Nothing in that house ever was. But over the weeks that came after, things shifted with the same slow deliberateness that had characterized everything between us from the beginning. Taehyung spoke to Mrs. Han about restructuring my role formally, not as a maid, but as a household manager with a defined scope, a different title, and compensation that no longer made my mother's medical bills feel like a weight I was carrying underwater. It was his way of addressing the professional boundary honestly, rather than pretending it wasn't there. He was careful. He was always careful. But careful, I had come to understand, was not the same as cold. It was the shape that responsibility took when it was worn by someone who understood the cost of being careless. My mother met him exactly once, 3 months later, when she came to Chicago for a follow-up appointment, and I mentioned where I worked. She was sharp and perceptive in the way that mothers are, and afterward she said only, "He watches the door when you walk through it." That's not nothing, Mia. She was right. It wasn't nothing. The world Taehyung operated in never became simple or easy or uncomplicated. Mrs. Han had been correct about that. There were difficult months, tense weeks, long evenings when the weight of what he carried was visible in the set of his shoulders, even when his face showed nothing. There were moments when I understood with complete clarity exactly how far outside ordinary my life had moved. I didn't pretend otherwise. I didn't romanticize the shadows or ignore the cost of proximity to a man whose influence reached places most people would never see. But I also knew this. He had read a file and remembered mine. He had asked about my mother before he had any reason to. He had stood in a corridor and told me the truth about something he could easily have kept hidden, because he thought I deserved the honest version of things. You learn a person not by what they say in easy moments, but by what they choose to say when saying it costs them something, by whether they tell you the truth when the easier option is silence. Taehyung Shin was a man of almost constant silence, which meant that every time he chose to speak, to me, plainly, without the careful layers he showed the rest of the world, it meant something specific and deliberate and chosen. I had started this job trying to be invisible. I had ended up being the only person in that house he ever truly let see him. And standing in the morning light of the library on an ordinary Thursday, nearly a year after a dinner on West Randolph had quietly rearranged the course of both our lives, I thought that was perhaps the most honest definition of belonging I had ever found. Not a dramatic declaration, not a single turning point, but the slow, accumulated choice of two people who had decided, carefully and with full awareness of the cost, to stop pretending they didn't see each other. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything.